Fuel. The call came in at 6:47 on a Thursday evening, which I remember because I was already 20 minutes into eating leftover Thai food in my truck outside a job in Pasadena and seriously considering calling it a day. The dispatcher said it was a plumbing emergency at a private residence in Los Feliz. Pipe had burst somewhere near the kitchen. The homeowner had already shut the water main, which told me she'd done this before, or at least had the sense to look it up. That part was a good sign. Everything else about the address told me it was going to be one of those houses. I packed up, tossed the rest of the food, and drove. The place sat back from the street on a long curved driveway, with mature pepper trees on both sides, stone facade, clean lines, the kind of landscaping that costs more per month than most people's car payments. I pulled up to the front, grabbed my bag, and rang the bell before I'd even had a chance to be impressed by any of it. She answered the door herself. Not a housekeeper, not an assistant, her. She was somewhere in her mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back in a way that looked like it had started neat about 4 hours ago, sleeves of a white button-down rolled to the elbows. There was a damp dish towel over her shoulder and water on her forearms, and she looked at me the way someone looks at a paramedic who just pulled up. Not dramatic about it, just relieved in a real and immediate way. "You're the plumber?" she said. "Yeah. Ethan." He stepped back to let me in. "The kitchen's this way. I've been holding a towel against the cabinet, underneath the sink for the last 40 minutes. My housekeeper is in the Palisades, and my neighbor's a dentist, so neither of them was going to help you." "Correct." The kitchen was large and open. The kind that looks designed for someone who entertains more than they actually cook. White marble, unlacquered brass, pendant lights that had probably been in an architectural magazine. Under the sink, a section of the supply line to the hot water side had separated at a compression fitting. Old fitting, stress fracture, probably had been leaking slow for weeks before it let go completely. Water had gotten into the base cabinet and was working its way toward the hardwood in the adjacent hallway. I got down on the floor and assessed it, while she crouched near me, with the dish towel still in her hands, like she wasn't ready to stop being useful. "How bad?" she asked. "Not catastrophic. The fitting failed, but you caught it before it hit the subfloor. I can replace this tonight. The cabinet lining's going to need to dry out. You'll want someone to check the hardwood in a couple days for warping." "That's manageable." "Yeah." I started pulling the damaged section. She didn't hover, but she didn't leave either. She stood by the island counter and answered emails on her phone, and occasionally asked a practical question. Not nervous questions, not small talk to fill silence. Actual questions. What caused it? Whether the other lines were at risk. Whether she needed to call her insurance. I told her what I knew and what I didn't. She listened without interrupting. At some point she said, "Do you want water? Coffee? I have both and I'm making coffee either way." I said coffee was fine. She made a full pot, not just a cup. That was the first small thing I noticed. I finished the repair in about 45 minutes, brought the water back up slowly, checked the pressure, watched for any drip at the new fittings for a few minutes to be sure. Everything held. She was sitting at the kitchen island when I stood up and wiped my hands on a shop rag, and she looked up from her laptop and said, "Done?" "Done. You'll want to leave that cabinet open tonight so the air can get to it. And keep an eye on the floor along that wall for the next 48 hours. She nodded and closed the laptop. "How much do I owe you?" I gave her the number. She didn't blink at it, didn't negotiate, didn't make any face at all. She just asked if she could pay by card through the app, or if I needed cash. I handed her the card reader, and while it was processing, she said, "I didn't catch your name earlier." "Ethan." "I'm Claire." She handed the reader back. "Thank you, Ethan. Genuinely. I was starting to think I was going to be sleeping at my sister's tonight." I said it was no problem and meant it. And then I packed my bag, and she walked me to the front door, and that was that. Except it wasn't, because I sat in the truck for a minute before I started it, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. I told myself I wasn't thinking about that house or that kitchen, or the way she'd made a full pot of coffee for a guy who was going to be there less than an hour. Told myself it was nothing. A service call that went fine. That lasted maybe 2 days. On Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number and a text that said, "Hi Ethan, this is Claire. Los Feliz pipe situation on Thursday. Quick question when you have a moment. I stared at it for a second, then wrote back that I had a moment now. She called immediately. Professional habit, probably. She asked about the hardwood, whether the slight discoloration along the baseboard she was seeing was cause for concern or just the wood drying out. I asked her to send a photo. She did. I looked at it and told her it was almost certainly fine, just moisture working its way out, but to give it another few days before sealing anything or calling a flooring contractor. She said, "Okay, that's what I thought, but I wanted a second opinion from someone who actually knows." Then, without any real transition, she said, "Can I ask how long you've been doing this?" I said about 8 years, 5 of them running my own calls. You like it? Nobody asks that. Not clients, not other guys in the trades, nobody. I had to actually think about it for a second. "Yeah," I said, "I do. There's something about it. Someone calls you with a real problem, and you fix it, and you leave and the thing works. It's satisfying in a way that's hard to explain to people." She was quiet for a moment. "No, I understand that completely." I believed her. We talked for another 10 minutes, which was about 9 minutes longer than any follow-up call I'd ever had with a client. When we hung up, I sat there looking out the window of my apartment for a while before I went and made breakfast. I told myself that was that. It wasn't. She texted 2 weeks later, not about the floor. Just, "The floor's fine, by the way. Completely back to normal." And then, 2 minutes after that, "Also, I think there might be something going on with the water pressure in the master bathroom. Would you have time next week to take a look?" I had time. When I got there, the water pressure was fine. Both of us knew it by the time I'd been in the bathroom for about 90 seconds. I didn't say that out loud. She didn't either. I checked every fixture, wrote up a clean report, and when I came back to the kitchen, she'd made that coffee again, and there were 2 mugs on the counter. She said, "The pressure seems normal." I said, "Yeah, it does." She looked at her mug. "I'm sorry. That was a pretense and it wasn't a particularly convincing one." Put down the report. I noticed. Are you annoyed?" "No." She looked up. "Good." We stood there for a second. "I just wanted to talk to you again," she said, "and I couldn't think of a normal way to make that happen, so I went with plumbing." I thought about the honest thing to say. This is actually the most normal way it's happened. That surprised her into a real laugh. Not polite, not managed, just real, and I felt something settle in my chest that I didn't know had been unsteady. We ended up on the back terrace with the coffee, and stayed out there for almost 2 hours. She told me she ran a landscape architecture firm. 6 full-time staff, projects up and down the coast. She'd had the house for 3 years and still felt like a guest in it most of the time. The terrace was the exception. She'd designed it herself, done most of the planting herself on weekends. That was where she went to remember that she actually knew how to do something with her hands. I told her I got that. She asked me where I lived. I told her. A 2-bedroom in Silver Lake with a roommate who worked nights, so we basically never saw each other. She nodded like that made sense. Then she said, "Do you ever think about doing something else? With the work, I mean?" "Sometimes. I want to build out a specialty in restoration jobs eventually. Older homes, the kind that have systems that were put in before anyone thought about standardizing anything. It's slower work and you can't rush it, but when you get it right, it lasts another 100 years. She turned toward me. "That's the first time you've said more than 4 sentences about yourself." I talk when I have something to say." She looked at me for a moment, like she was deciding something. Then she said, "I believe you." After that, it got easier and harder at the same time. Easier, because the excuses stopped mattering. She started texting without a reason, just because something had happened that she wanted to tell someone. I found myself doing the same thing. Not long texts, not anything that could be called a conversation on paper. Just the small daily things that you start sharing with someone when they've quietly become the person you want to share them with. Harder, because I kept running the math in my head, and the math never came out clean. Her firm had just been featured in an Architectural Digest piece about designers redefining residential landscapes on the West Coast. I'd read it on my phone in a parking lot without telling her. The article had a photo of her at a job site in Malibu in a hard hat and field boots, pointing at something on a set of drawings, and she looked so at home in that context, so visibly in command, that I had to sit with a strange, uncomfortable feeling for a while before I could name it. It wasn't jealousy. It was the feeling of looking at someone's real life and wondering where on earth you'd fit in it. She called me that same week and asked if I wanted to grab food. Not a pretense this time, no plumbing involved. Just food. I said yes. Then spent about 20 minutes more than I should have thinking about where I was going to suggest. She beat me to it. A taco place in Echo Park, counter service, picnic tables outside, string lights over everything. Not what I expected. When I got there, she was already at a table with chips, and she was wearing a jacket I'd seen once before, and looked entirely unbothered about being anywhere in particular. I sat down across from her, and she said, "I was worried you'd suggest somewhere fancy to impress me." I thought about it. "I know you did." She pushed the chips toward me. "I'm glad you didn't." We were there for 3 hours. She asked about my family. I told her about my dad, who'd been a general contractor in Fresno until his back gave out and he'd transitioned to teaching trade skills at a community college, and seemed genuinely happier about that than he'd ever been building things. She listened to all of it. I asked about hers. She talked about her mother, who'd had very clear ideas about what Claire's life was supposed to look like and had spent considerable energy making sure Claire knew how far the landscape firm and the unmarried situation and the house that was always a little too quiet fell outside those ideas. She said it without bitterness, just plainly, like she'd made her peace with it, but still felt the weight. "She's not wrong about the quiet," Claire said. "The house is too quiet. I know that." I didn't say anything. "I'm not complaining," she added. "I built the quiet on purpose after the last relationship. I just sometimes think I overcorrected." I looked at her across the table. "What happened with the last relationship?" She broke a chip in half, looked at it. "He was in the industry. We had the same language, the same references, the same contacts. On paper, it made complete sense. But he treated the relationship the same way he treated a project," she said, efficiently, with clear deliverables. Every conversation felt like a progress meeting. She looked up. "I'm very good at my job, Ethan. I don't want my personal life to feel like my job." I held that for a second. "You want something that doesn't perform," I said. She looked at me. "Yes, exactly." String lights came on at some point while we were still sitting there, and neither of us moved to leave. On the drive home, I had that same feeling from the truck outside her house the first night. The feeling of sitting still a second longer than necessary, trying to work out what exactly was happening and what I was going to do about it. The problem wasn't the obvious thing. It wasn't money, not exactly. It was something harder to name. She lived a life that had its own gravity, its own orbit, and I could feel the edges of it from where I was standing. The AD article, the Malibu job site, the firm with 6 people who depended on her, the house that had its own ecosystem of contractors and housekeepers and neighbors who knew her name. I was a guy with a service truck and a specialty I was still building, and a roommate I never saw. I kept thinking about what it would look like from the outside. Not because I cared about the outside view, exactly, but because I knew at some point the outside view would become part of what we had to live in. And I didn't know if I had enough confidence in myself yet to stand inside that without flinching. You could tell. Of course she could. One evening about 3 weeks later, she called and I let it ring once longer than usual. When I picked up, she said, without any preamble, "Are you pulling back?" No. You're quieter. I was on my couch with the TV off and the apartment doing that thing it did when my roommate was at work, and the whole place was just mine, and felt both comfortable and like something was missing. "I've been thinking." "About what?" I said the honest thing. "About how I don't know how to be the person in your life who fits." She was quiet for long enough that I thought maybe I'd gotten it wrong. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you something and I want you to actually hear it." Her voice had changed, still calm, but a different kind of calm. "I have been in relationships with men who fit perfectly, who knew the same restaurants and the same architects and went to the same charity events and always said the right things to my mother. You know what I felt in those relationships?" I didn't answer. "Manage," she said. I felt managed, like I was something to be handled correctly. She let that sit. You. What I feel when I talk to you is the opposite of that. You push back when you disagree. You don't laugh at things that aren't funny. You made a whole pot of coffee for a stranger who was having a hard night and didn't make it into anything. I don't know how to explain to you why that matters, but it does. I sat with that. Here. I'm not asking you to fit some shape I have in my head, she said. I'm asking you to stay in the room with me long enough to see what the shape actually is. I didn't have a good answer. Not right then. I told her I needed to think, and to her credit, she said okay and hung up without making me feel worse about it. I went for a long drive that night. South on the 110, no destination, just the freeway and the lights and the radio low. Ended up parked at a beach access lot in San Pedro, with the windows down, listening to the water. Sat there and thought about what I was actually afraid of. Not failure, not the gap between our lives, not really. What I was afraid of was letting myself believe it and being wrong, letting myself build something in my head, and having her realize at some point that I was a phase. A pleasant detour. The interesting thing that happened before real life resumed. That fear was mine, though. She hadn't given it to me. I drove home and texted her, I'm not pulling back, I'm just slow to trust good things. She wrote back 4 words, I know. It's okay. After that, I stopped doing the math. Things found a shape without us designing it. She started showing up in small pieces of my daily life, and I started showing up in hers. I saw the office once when she forgot her keys, and I happened to be 2 blocks away and dropped them off. It was a converted craftsman in Silver Lake, drafting tables and plot plans, and a kitchen that smelled like the rosemary plant she kept on the windowsill and burned through coffee. Her whole staff said hi to me by name, which meant she'd talked about me. That hit different than I expected. She came to a restoration job I was doing on a 1920s bungalow in Highland Park one Saturday afternoon, just to see what it looked like. She stood in the hallway where I'd opened up a wall to replace supply lines, and she studied everything with the same focus she probably brought to job sites of her own. She didn't try to make it romantic or significant. She just looked and asked real questions and said, when we were back out front in the sun, this is the work you meant. I can see why you want more of it. Nobody had ever said that to me at a job site before. The shift was gradual enough that I missed it until it had already happened. There wasn't a specific night or specific moment. There was just a point where I realized I wasn't bracing anymore, where I got into my truck after leaving her place and didn't sit there trying to recalibrate, where her text made me smile before I'd even read the whole thing. That was new. One Sunday in March, we were at a farmer's market in Atwater Village that she went to most weeks. Late morning, good light, the kind of LA weather that makes you understand why everyone moved here. We'd gotten coffee from a cart and she was looking at a table of citrus like she had opinions about it, which she did, and I was watching her the way you watch someone when you're not trying to hide it anymore. He looked over and caught me. What? She said. Nothing. You're doing the thing again. What thing? The thing where you look at me like you're still deciding. I took a sip of my coffee. I decided. She went still for a second. Then she put down the lemon she was holding and turned toward me fully. When? A while ago. I just needed to be sure I meant it. She looked at me for a long moment, not moving, not filling the space with anything. Then she said, I meant it first. Hey, I know. And you made me wait. Yeah, I said. I'm sorry about that. She picked the lemon back up and looked at it. You're buying this. I bought it. And the bunch of herbs she picked out after, and the bread from the next table, and all of it ended up in her kitchen that afternoon where we made something out of what we had, and sat at the counter eating, while afternoon light came through the windows, and made everything look like it had been there for years. That was when I understood something I hadn't had language for before. It wasn't about the house or the firm or the gap between our addresses, or any version of the math I'd been running. It was about what happened in the room when it was just us. The way she'd relax her shoulders somewhere in the first few minutes of being together, like she'd been holding them up all day. The way she'd say something and then watch my face to see what I actually thought, not what I was going to say. The way I felt like I could take up space without apologizing for it. That was the rare thing, not the house, not the money, not any of the things I'd been measuring myself against. The rare thing was the room. A few weeks after the farmer's market, she called me on a Tuesday evening and said she wanted to show me something. I drove over and she met me in the driveway with a folder of papers and a look on her face that I couldn't read right away. Inside the folder was a proposal. Not for us, not some grand gesture. For a business arrangement. She'd identified an older Spanish colonial in Silver Lake that was being sold by an estate, needed significant systems work before it could be renovated. She'd been approached about the landscape contract, but had walked the property, and the plumbing and electrical were going to be someone's major project first. She wanted to refer me. "This isn't a gift," she said immediately before I could react. "This is a legitimate job. The estate wants someone who specializes in older homes." I told them I knew someone. I looked at the papers. "The budget is serious," she said. "The project timeline is 6 months minimum. It could be the kind of work you've been building toward." I looked up at her. "I'm not trying to fix your life," she said, and her voice was measured but her eyes weren't. "I'm telling you that I paid attention. I listened when you talked about what you wanted. And this crossed my desk and I thought of you first." She paused. "I always think of you first now." Something in my chest did the thing it sometimes did around her, that quiet seismic thing that I'd stopped fighting. "You don't have to take it," she said. "Say no if it doesn't feel right. But I wanted you to know the work exists, and that it's real, and that you're the right person for it." I folded the proposal closed. I looked at her, standing there in her driveway, with the evening light behind her, and the professional composure and everything underneath it that only I knew was there. The tiredness she let herself show, the laughter that was real and not managed, the way she sometimes talked about her work. With this private wonder that I don't think she let most people see. "I'll look at it," I said. That's all I'm asking." I took a step toward her. "I'm not saying yes to the job right now." Okay. "I'm saying something else." She waited. "I think you're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time," I said. "And I'm done treating that like something to be careful with." She held my eyes for a second, and I watched something release in her face. "Good," she said quietly, "because I am tired of waiting for you to catch up." I laughed. It was that simple and that easy, which is how you know something is real. Not the grand moment, not the perfect speech. Just her exhaling finally, and me catching up like she said, and the folder still in my hand, and the evening going amber around us like it had nowhere better to be. I took the job. Her. The Spanish colonial took 8 months and changed everything about what I thought was possible in the work. And Claire showed up on that job site more than once, not to check on me, just because she wanted to see what was happening with the bones of the place. She'd walk the rooms with her field boots on, and her eyes moving over everything, and she was so clearly at home in that context that I'd sometimes stop what I was doing just to watch. One morning in October, about a week before the systems inspection, she was standing in the main hallway where I'd finished a full repipe the day before. New copper lines, all the fittings clean and tight, the work as good as anything I'd ever done. She ran, her hand along the wall the way you do when you're thinking about what's behind it. "It's going to last 100 years, she said. "At least." She turned and looked at me across the hallway with the morning light coming through the old casement windows and the house quiet and solid around us. "So will this," she said. I didn't argue with her. I think about that first night a lot. Not the pipe, not the repair, the coffee. She made a full pot for a stranger who was going to be gone in under an hour. Nobody does that by accident. That's just who someone is. And I almost missed all of it because I was too busy measuring the distance between her life and mine to notice that she wasn't measuring anything at all. That's the part I keep coming back to. I spent months running numbers that didn't matter. The house, the firm, the magazine article, the Malibu job site. I built a case for why it couldn't work, and I almost convinced myself to believe it. What I didn't account for was the cause and effect of small, honest things. She made coffee. She called back about a floor she already knew was fine. She showed up at a job site in field boots because she actually wanted to see the work. Every one of those things was information, and I kept refusing to read it. There's something I've learned about the way good things come apart before they start. It's almost never the big dramatic reason. It's the small retreat. The text you answer a little slower. The distance you start building before anyone asks you to. I was doing all of that without realizing it, and Claire saw it clearly before I did. She called it what it was, leaving before I left. That kind of honesty takes something. Takes the willingness to say the uncomfortable true thing instead of letting someone drift away cleanly. Most people don't do that. She did, and it changed everything. I've thought about what it actually took to stay. Not the feelings part. That was never the hard part. The hard part was deciding I was worth believing in. That my work mattered, that my direction was real, that I didn't have to shrink down to some version of myself that seemed less likely to embarrass either of us at a dinner party. The willingness to hold your ground about who you are, even when someone else's life looks more finished than yours. That's not arrogance. That's just knowing yourself well enough to stop apologizing for it. Ethan with the service truck and the specialty he was still building was the person she wanted. Not a polished version, not a gap closed. Me as I actually was. And here's the thing about the work. The Spanish colonial took 8 months. It was hard, slow, technical work on systems that hadn't been touched in decades. It was exactly what I described to her that night by the water when I thought I was just talking out loud. She remembered. She paid attention when I thought nobody was. That's not luck. That's what happens when you're honest about what you want, and you stay in the room long enough with someone who actually listens. I'm not saying it always works out this cleanly. I know it doesn't. But I think about Claire running her hand along that freshly repiped wall and saying it would last 100 years. And I think the same principle applies to most things worth building. You find the right materials. You don't rush the connections. You do the work right the first time, even when no one's watching. And if you're paying attention, sometimes the thing you build outlasts everything you were afraid of. That's what I took from all of it. Do honest work. Know who you are. Don't quit on the good thing because you're scared it might quit on you first.